All right, let's dive right in. Imagine your country is surrounded by water. That big, beautiful ocean. It's your greatest defense, right? But what if the ultimate weapon, a nuclear bomb, could actually turn that shield into your biggest weakness? Yeah, it sounds crazy. Today, we're going to unpack this really high-stakes paradox of nuclear weapons for maritime states.
So if you're a country that can't exactly afford a massive, top-of-the-line nuclear arsenal, the idea of let's call it a shortcut, is pretty tempting, isn't it? I mean, could smaller tactical nukes give you the same kind of security, but for just a fraction of the price? It's a really compelling question, and honestly, it's the core of what we're digging into today.
I mean, the logic seems simple enough, right? If you can't get your hands on those big, city-busting strategic missiles, then hey, maybe a smaller battlefield nuke is the next best thing. It feels like a pretty smart way to level the playing field. But, and this is a huge but, as we're about to see, this whole shortcut idea, it's built on a seriously flawed, even dangerous foundation.
And this gets right to the heart of what nuclear deterrence is all about. Look, it's not just about having the bomb. It's a psychological game, through and through. The whole thing only works if your enemy is 100% convinced, no doubts whatsoever, that you can and you will hit them back so hard that even thinking about starting a fight is just off the table. It's all about credibility.
Right, but that word, credibility, that's the whole problem. What happens when your arsenal just isn't big enough to guarantee that unbearable damage? What if your only nuclear card to play is a smaller, tactical one? Well, this is exactly where that tempting shortcut starts to look less like a clever solution and a whole lot more like a trap.
Okay, let's tackle the first major issue head on. Strategists have a term for it, the problem of asymmetric escalation. Now just think of it like this. You and your opponent are on a ladder. The thing is, they have all the rungs going all the way to the top. But you're missing the top few. That's a scary place to be.
Just look at how unbalanced this standoff is. Let's say you use your one and only tactical nuke. Boom. You've just crossed the nuclear threshold. But now what? Seriously, what's your next move? Your opponent, sitting there with their massive arsenal, they hold all the cards. They can choose to back down, or they can choose to unleash absolute, overwhelming force in return. And you've got nothing left. You've played your only card, and you have absolutely no way to counter their biggest threat.
So the bottom line is pretty stark. The second you use that tactical weapon, you've handed over the reins. You've given the escalation initiative. That's the control over how much worse things are about to get entirely to your adversary. This doesn't create stability, not even close. It creates massive, profound instability because their worst-case response is still on the table, and it's a possibility you just can't do anything about. Okay, so if that wasn't complicated enough, now we get to the really mind-bending part of this whole thing. This is where geography itself, the very land and sea you're standing on, becomes the enemy. For an island nation, this is the point where the entire logic of nuclear defense gets completely flipped on its head.
The political scientist John Mearsheimer has this famous phrase, the stopping power of water. And it's a brilliant way to describe how oceans and other huge bodies of water act like these massive natural defensive walls. They make it incredibly difficult for an army to invade. So for any maritime nation, the ocean is, without a doubt, its greatest shield.
But here's the twist. That shield, it's also your lifeline. The very same waters that protect you are also home to your most critical economic assets. We're talking about the shipping lanes bringing in your food, your energy, your supplies, not to mention the fishing zones that feed your people. So the shield and the lifeline, they're literally one and the same thing.
So let's really picture this for a second. An enemy fleet is steaming towards your shores. To stop them, you make the call. You detonate a small, tactical nuke right in your own coastal waters. The very waters you control, where you fish, where your resources are. The invasion is stopped. Mission accomplished, right? But was that really a victory? Or was it a self-blockade, an active economic suicide? Because that radioactive fallout, it doesn't just vanish into thin air. It contaminates your waters, your ports, your fishing grounds. In trying to block the enemy, you've actually just blockaded yourself. This is the absolute core paradox we're talking about. It's called a self-induced vulnerability. It's when your defensive weapon, used in the very environment you're trying to protect, becomes a tool for your own self-sabotage. You literally do the enemy's job for them, choking off your own economy without them having to fire another shot. It's just wild when you think about it.
Okay, so if having your own tactical nukes is basically a trap,
What about another option? What about sharing them with a powerful ally? The US does this with some NATO countries. They station American nukes on their soil. Surely that must solve the problem, right?
Well, unfortunately, not really. See, the big catch with nuclear sharing is that you don't actually hold the keys to the car. The final authority, the decision to actually launch, that stays with the country that owns the weapons. It's a really powerful political signal of an alliance, for sure, but it doesn't actually give you strategic control. And this is the big one, it still leaves you stuck on that same broken escalation ladder we were talking about before.
And believe it or not, it gets even more dangerous at sea. A nuclear blast on land is one thing, but in the ocean, it's a whole different ballgame. You've got unpredictable currents that can carry radioactive fallout for hundreds, maybe thousands of miles. Suddenly, you're hitting neutral ships, you're contaminating international waters, and what you meant as a limited surgical warning shot suddenly looks like an uncontrollable all-out attack to the rest of the world. You could easily trigger the exact massive retaliation you were trying to avoid in the first place.
So, where does this all leave us? What's the big takeaway here? Well, so often, the whole debate around tactical nuclear weapons gets framed as this simple black and white choice. Should we have them or not?
But that's just the wrong question to be asking. The real question, the one that truly matters, is about consequences. Specifically, what are the consequences of using this weapon in this specific place? Because for a maritime nation, geography isn't just a factor. It's everything. And that unique geography transforms a tactical nuke from a supposed asset into a deep, profound, and frankly, inescapable liability.
Which leaves us with one last big question to think about. For a nation whose greatest defense has always been the sea around it, does trying to turn that shield into a weapon risk turning that very same shield into a permanent, self-imposed cage?
Welcome back to The Deep Dive. Today, we're taking a deep structural look at strategic choices, specifically for nations that live by the sea. Our source material today really zeroes in on this fascinating dilemma. What happens when a maritime state, often an island nation, finds it politically or just institutionally impossible to get its hands on strategic nuclear weapons?
They look for other options, ways to make up for it. And the two most common pathways they explore are tactical nuclear weapons, or TNW, and nuclear sharing agreements with a major ally.
Right.
But the core argument we're drawing out of these sources is, well, it's pretty provocative.
Which is?
That instead of making deterrence more stable, these alternatives, the TNW or the nuclear sharing, might actually, structurally, increase the risk of escalation and national vulnerability, too.
Particularly for these island nations we're talking about.
Exactly, because of their unique geography.
Okay, so let's be absolutely clear on the mission here before we go any further. This deep dive is not an argument for or against any nation having strategic nuclear weapons. We are completely sidestepping that whole debate.
Exactly. This is a structural analysis. Our whole mission is to clarify the geopolitical, the strategic consequences that pop up, specifically when a state relies on these other options, TNW or nuclear sharing, but without having that top-tier strategic retaliatory capability.
So it's about what the strategy looks like when you only hold the middle rung of the escalation ladder, but not the top one.
That's a great way to put it.
So the key question for us is, what happens when geography and the specific limitations of certain weapon systems just completely clash in the highest stakes world of defense doctrine?
Yeah.
Let's jump right in at the foundation then. Let's start with the classical definition of nuclear deterrence.
Okay, so if we go back to the foundational thinking, the ideas laid out by Brodie and Schelling way back in the mid-20th century, deterrence is so much more than just owning a weapon. It's about making sure your adversary fundamentally believes that you have the capacity and the will to inflict just intolerable, catastrophic damage on their most vital centers. That's the retaliatory capability you need.
It's the assurance that if they hit your capital, you can hit theirs. Simple as that. It's that ultimate escalation ceiling that makes the whole terrifying strategy work.
And that ceiling is absolutely essential for stability. Historically, tactical nuclear weapons were designed as, well, exactly what their name suggests. Tactical tools.
For the battlefield.
For the battlefield. The lower rungs on that escalation ladder. But, and this is critical, they were always, in both U.S. and Soviet doctrine, backed up by the ultimate threat, the big strategic nuclear forces.
But if you take away that strategic ceiling, the whole equation just gets thrown out of whack. You're introducing a massive asymmetry.
Absolutely. Think about what happens. A state uses a TNW. right? So they've now set a precedent for using nuclear weapons. But they don't have that ability to hit back at the enemy's homeland in a catastrophic way.
So they've just given up a huge advantage.
A massive one. You've just transferred what the source material calls the escalation leadership directly to your enemy.
Okay, let's unpack that phrase, escalation leadership. What does that mean in practical terms for someone trying to understand this?
It means the adversary holds all the cards. They get to decide what happens next. They can respond conventionally, or they could dramatically escalate to a strategic threat of their own, or they can just use your own TNW attack as political leverage against you.
Because you've shown you're willing to go nuclear.
You've shown you're willing to go nuclear, but you've given them the final say on how far up that ladder things go, and they don't have to fear a proportional existential strike in return.
Because they still hold the ultimate ace. They can wipe you out, and you can't do the same back to them.
Precisely. And scholars like Robert Jervis have explored this. While, real-world crises are messy and complicated, the mere fact that the adversary structurally holds the option for the absolute worst-case scenario for you is, in itself, a huge destabilizing factor.
So it's the structural imbalance that matters most.
It really is. Regardless of what anyone intends in the moment, the second you fire a TNW without that strategic backup, you are in a strategically terrible position.
You've accepted all the risks of using the weapon, but you've gained none of the ultimate strategic leverage. That brings us neatly to geography, because TNWs were never meant to be used just anywhere.
No, not at all. The historical playbook for TNW doctrine was written by and for continental states. The preconditions were very, very specific.
Like what?
Well, you needed vast land battlefields. You needed buffer zones, think Eastern Europe during the Cold War, that were far away from your own command centers. And crucially, you needed the ability to partially abandon or accept contamination in some remote areas without it paralyzing your entire nation.
So you could externalize the battlefield. You could fight it out in the borderlands, far from your own economic and political heartland.
That ability to externalize is the key, the defining feature. You had geographical depth, so you could tolerate some contamination.
Now, we often hear the Pakistan example brought up their short-range TNW system, the Nasser. It's cited as a success story of using battlefield nukes for deterrence without huge strategic backing. But the sources we're looking at argue this interpretation is, well, it's pretty misleading if you try to apply it everywhere.
It is, because the Pakistan doctrine, as analysts have detailed, is designed for a very specific land invasion by a much larger conventional army. And crucially, the sources point out that their nuclear doctrine generally puts maritime warfare completely outside the scope of nuclear use.
Wait a second. So if their own TNW doctrine explicitly says we won't use these at sea, that just confirms that this weapon system is deeply dependent on specific land-based geography.
It's designed to stop tanks, not ships.
It's a land-based deterrent for a land-based threat. And this right here sets up the structural paradox for any island or maritime nation that tries to go down this path.
Yes. If they choose TNWs, they can't assume any of those same geographical buffers will apply. In fact, the complete opposite happens.
And this is where we get to the core of it. The maritime paradox. Unlike a continental state, a maritime nation can't just externalize the battlefield. The sea is their lifeline.
And what's truly fascinating and terrifying is the physical overlap. The defensive zones where you'd want to stop an invasion, your territorial waters, your exclusive economic zone, or EEZ, these are the exact same places where your major ports are, your fishing grounds, your vital sea lanes of communication, your SLOCs.
So your defensive action happens right on your own doorstep. If you use a TNW to stop an invasion fleet, you are literally contaminating your own front yard.
And this is the great inversion we have to think about. Mearheimer's classic theory talks about the stopping power of water, right? The idea that the sea acts as this great defensive barrier that protects you.
It makes an invasion really hard.
It does. But for a maritime state that uses a nuclear weapon inside its own EEZ, that logic gets turned completely on its head. Instead of stopping the enemy, the nuclear use creates what the sources call the self-blockade phenomenon.
A self-blockade. Wow. That is an incredibly powerful and, frankly, terrifying term. How does that work?
The radioactive contamination from using a TNW in those crucial coastal waters, it forms an impenetrable barrier. And yes, it successfully blocks the enemy. You achieve your tactical goal. But it simultaneously cuts off your own nation's access to its essential maritime functions.
Which means blocking your own major shipping routes, making your key ports unusable, destroying your fishing stocks. potentially for decades.
Precisely. We're talking about massive economic asphyxiation. For a highly import-dependent maritime state, which might rely on those sea lanes for, say, 90% of its energy and food, this self-induced loss of marine function is the same as a successful enemy naval blockade.
Except you did it to yourself.
You did it to yourself, and the enemy never even had to fire a conventional shot. The cure becomes the disease, but with this horrifying strategic twist. You stop the invasion, congratulations. But in the process, you committed economic suicide. Who is going to insure a vessel trying to dock at a port near a radioactive plume?
No one. Global shipping firms would reroute instantly. Insurance would be impossible. The international community, fearing contaminated cargo, would effectively boycott those sea lanes. It's this paradox where the very act of physical defense destroys your own basis for survival.
That's self-induced vulnerability right there.
And that structural limit feels like the key takeaway for maritime states thinking about TNWs. The weapon system itself is just geographically incompatible with their survival strategy.
It is.
Okay, so let's pivot to that second option, nuclear sharing. This sounds, on the surface, like a great workaround. You get the deterrent umbrella without all the cost and hassle of developing the warhead yourself. But what are the institutional limits?
Well, the limits are baked right into the agreements. If you look at the NATO model for nuclear sharing, it only ever involves non-strategic weapons. And, fundamentally, the nation that owns the nukes, the U.S., in NATO's case, always retains final authority over their use.
So sharing doesn't actually give the non-nuclear state any real control?
Not over the strategic process, no. The source material is very clear on this. Sharing does not grant strategic autonomy. You can't guarantee that the ultimate retaliatory strike will be used on your behalf if things really go south.
So the sharing state takes on huge risks, like maybe even hosting these weapons on its own soil.
Massive battlefield risk, yes.
Without getting any real control over the strategic off-ramp or on-ramp, it basically locks in that same structural asymmetry we were just talking about.
It does. It reinforces it. You absorb the risk, but you don't get the strategic control.
And this ties right back into the theory of limited nuclear deterrence, the idea that you can, limit nuclear use to specific targets to avoid an all-out war. But that whole theory depends on one thing.
On the signal being received correctly.
Okay.
On your intended message of restraint being accurately understood by a high-stress adversary.
And this is where the sea itself becomes a huge problem. What the sources call signaling failure at sea.
Mm-hmm.
Why is the sea such a bad environment for signaling compared to land?
Well, because on land, things are relatively clear. The conflict zone, the damage radius, the geographical limits, it's all pretty contained. You hit a border unit, that's a signal. But at sea or underwater, the context is just completely fluid and uncontrollable.
The physics change everything.
They really do. The way shock waves propagate, the unpredictable way that radioactive water contamination spreads, it can travel hundreds of miles from the blast, and the fluid boundaries just make precise, limited control almost impossible. And on top of that, there's a huge risk of hitting some unintended third-party vessel out on the high seas.
Right. You fire what you think is a warning shot, but the plume and the shockwave get carried by the currents. Suddenly you've contaminated an international fishing fleet or knocked out a cargo ship from a neutral country. That's not a limited signal, that's global chaos.
Exactly. The intended message, hey, this is a limited political demonstration, not an escalation to total war, it gets completely garbled in the noise. Yeah. And because of that fluid nature, using a TNW at sea has a much, much higher chance of being misinterpreted by your adversary as an indiscriminate all-out attack.
So you fire a low-level shot, but the enemy sees it as a full-scale strategic threat. And that non-symmetry in perception just skyrockets the chances of an uncontrollable retaliatory spiral that you, the TNW user, have no strategic way to stop.
And that's it. The institutional limits of the sharing agreement, combined with the geographical limits of trying to send a clear signal at sea, they both reinforce the exact same structural vulnerability. You lack control over the ultimate strategic outcome.
So let's bring this all together. We've covered the classical asymmetry, the geographical straitjacket of TNW doctrine, the catastrophic self-blockade paradox for island nations, and these institutional limits of nuclear sharing and signaling failure at sea.
Yeah, and the central finding here is really clear. The source material acknowledges that, okay, TNW or nuclear sharing might complement deterrence in certain situations, mainly for continental states with lots of land. But under the structural constraints of a maritime state that doesn't have its own strategic backup, these options are functionally likely to decrease stability and amplify national vulnerability.
So the analysis moves beyond that simple political question of, nukes or no nukes. The crucial takeaway here for you, the listener, is to understand the structural consequences that specific force structures create when they clash with immutable geographic reality. The structure itself is the destabilizing factor.
It's the worst-case structural outcome that has to inform policy, not just the best-case tactical one.
This has profound implications for anyone advising a maritime state on their defense planning. So we'll leave you with this final provocative thought to explore on your own. If a nation cannot guarantee that its own defensive nuclear action won't immediately lead to its own economic strangulation, that self-blockade, how does that fundamentally redefine the purpose and efficacy of its entire defense strategy?
Right.
Is that strategy really about defense anymore, or is it just a different, maybe slower form of self-assured destruction, something to consider as you navigate the complexities of strategic deterrence?